Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're inviting you to consider something, a hidden force maybe, something playing out in society.
Yeah, a really potent force and almost paradoxical, It's been shaping things for centuries.
Exactly. It's this dynamic that can kind of turn morality completely on its head.
And you see its fingerprints on everything, really, from like ancient witch hunts all the way up to today's online outrage.
It's definitely unsettling when you start looking at it, but also deeply insightful and incredibly relevant to how we understand ourselves.
That's right. Our deep dive today is all about unpacking a complex, but incredibly powerful concept from psychoanalysis. It's the paraphilic superego.
The paraphilic superego.
Yeah, it sounds academic, but it's basically this paradoxical mix. You've got moral law on one side and perverse enjoyment on the other.
A chilling combination.
It really is. And it just might explain a lot about why we act the way we do, individually, but also as groups.
So our mission today is to reveal how that stern voice of conscience inside us, the one telling us right from wrong, how it can actually become corrupted.
Right. How it can secretly start commanding us to find this, twisted pleasure in the very acts it supposedly forbids.
We'll explore its theoretical roots, look at some honestly chilling case studies from history.
Yeah, some really stark examples.
And then bring it right up to the present day, spotlighting how it shows up in media, politics, even our daily lives. It's surprisingly common.
And the goal here isn't just to understand what this force is, but really why it matters, why it's so profound for understanding desire, authority, and, your own sense of self.
We're really going to explore this subject deeply today, getting into all the facets from our source material.
Absolutely. Let's start unpacking it.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the paraphilic superego, we kind of need to go back to the beginning, the original superego concept.
Yeah.
Let's start with Freud. How did he first describe it?
Well, for Freud, the superego is basically our internalized authority. It's that harsh moral conscience that we develop, from parents, from society's rules.
Right.
It kind of sits inside us, constantly judging our ego, our conscious self, and punishing us with guilt, with shame when we transgress, or even think about transgressing.
He saw it as a sort of a watchdog.
Yeah, a watchdog of civilization, exactly, planted right inside our own minds.
But even Freud hinted there was something more going on, right?
Yeah.
He saw a kind of paradox with this watchdog.
He absolutely did. It's one of the fascinating parts of his work. Freud noticed that the more virtuous someone tried to be, the more strict and unforgiving their superego seemed to become.
Huh. So trying harder made it worse.
Pretty much. It was as if the more you tried to please this internal judge, the more guilt and self-punishment it dished out.
Wow.
Yeah, and this led him to hint at something like a need for punishment. He suggested that maybe suffering under the law could bring its own grim satisfaction.
Okay, so that's already hinting at some kind of enjoyment mixed in with the morality.
Exactly. It opens the door just a crack to that idea.
So if that's Freud's starting point, how did Jacques Lacan take this and, reinterpret it?
Yeah.
Because he famously flipped it, didn't he?
Oh, completely. Lacan took Freud's idea and basically turned it inside out. He argued the superego isn't just about saying, thou shalt not.
Okay.
His famous line is, nothing forces anyone to enjoy except the superego. The superego is the imperative of jouissance and joy.
Enjoy. That sounds counterintuitive for a moral conscience.
It's startling, right? It means that beyond the explicit prohibition, there's this other command, an obscene supplementary command that actually pushes us to enjoy, often in a transgressive way.
And jouissance. That's not just simple pleasure, is it?
No, not at all. It's a key Lacanian term. It's more like an excessive, difficult, even painful enjoyment. It goes beyond basic gratification, often tied up with transgression or suffering.
Okay, that's a mind-bending idea. So it's not just stopping you, it's secretly telling you to find some dark satisfaction. Can you maybe give an example?
Sure. Think about a parent telling a child, you must go to grandma's birthday. That's the clear, explicit law. Pretty straightforward.
Right.
But the superegoic parent, the one operating with this hidden command, might say something like, Grandma really wants to see you, but you should only go if you truly want to.
Ah, okay. Sounds nicer on the surface.
It sounds permissive, yeah, like it's offering a choice, but the hidden message is much more insidious. It's like saying, you should want to go, and you should enjoy making Grandma happy. If you don't genuinely want to, well, you're a bad, ungrateful child, and you should feel guilty for not having the right feelings.
Wow. So you're ordered not just to obey, but to enjoy obeying.
Precisely, and enjoy it in the right way. It's an impossible command, really. And it makes you feel guilty for not wanting what the law wants you to want, for not feeling the correct kind of jouissance.
So the superego then links the law with our drives,
Yeah.
making the prohibition itself a source of this excessive pleasure or pain.
Exactly. The forbidden thing becomes tempting partly because it's forbidden, and obeying brings its own complicated satisfaction.
That's a really powerful way to understand it. And Slavoj Žižek, he really ran with this, didn't he? Describing the superego as an obscene, paradoxical engine.
He absolutely did. Žižek's work is crucial here. He argues that every public law, every official rule has this unofficial, obscene underside.
An underside.
Yeah, like unwritten rules or transgressive practices that secretly prop up the law's power. He gives this really chilling example. Racial segregation in the American South.
Okay.
The official laws enforced white supremacy, but things like lynchings, extreme violence against black people, these actually violated the written law, but they were sort of permitted in practice for whites.
Allowed to happen, even though illegal.
Right. And Žižek argues this bound the white community together through a kind of shared guilt and, horribly, a shared enjoyment of that transgression. This obscene, unwritten law of permissible violence was actually what sustained the official written law.
That's a stark illustration of that obscene underside. And Žižek says this enjoy command is still with us today, just maybe in different forms.
Oh, absolutely. He argues that in modern society, we're not so much bombarded with an external no anymore. Instead, it's messages like relax, consume, be happy, be yourself, live your best life.
Which sound positive, but
they feel like commands, don't they? We must achieve enjoyment. We must perform happiness. And if we fail, we feel guilty, inadequate.
Ah, I see. So it's permitted enjoyment turned into ordained enjoyment, as he puts it.
Exactly. You feel guilty for not being happy enough, for not taking all the opportunities to enjoy that society throws at you. Think about social media, the pressure to display a perfect, enjoyable life.
Right. And the guilt if you don't feel that way.
Žižek describes the modern superego as this constant injunction to pursue jouissance, maybe through buying things or getting likes, combined with this never-ending guilt for falling short. He calls the superego a figure of obscene enjoyment.
Like those totalitarian leaders he mentions who condemn vice publicly but indulge privately?
Precisely. It's that hypocrisy, that split. He even makes this analogy like guilt-free evil is like fat-free salami in totalitarian regimes.
Yeah.
Obeying the leader allows you to transgress normal moral rules without feeling the usual guilt.
Okay, so psychoanalytic theory really transformed the superego from just a moral conscience into this split paradoxical force. Official law versus this shadow law that enjoys.
That's the core transformation, yeah.
So if the superego already has this perverse, obscene character, as Lacan and Žižek describe it, what does adding the term paraphilic really emphasize? What does that specific word add to our understanding?
That's a really crucial distinction to make. Paraphilic, as you know, usually refers to sexual perversions like fetishism or voyeurism. So applying it to the superego means the superego itself, the internal law, has been fundamentally overtaken by perverse logics. It's not just forbidding things anymore.
It's doing something else.
Yeah. It's like it starts to flaunt itself. It fetishizes certain acts or rules.
Yeah.
And it derives this lurid jouissance, that dark, excessive enjoyment we talked about, from the very behaviors it's condemning.
So it's law in the service of perversion, a law that actually gets off on its own violation and enforcement.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. It's not just about inducing private guilt like Freud's classical superego might.
How is it different then?
Well, the paraphilic one actively harnesses desire. It channels it into these outlets that are maybe morally sanctioned on the surface, but have this perverse tinge underneath. It kind of stage manages transgression as a spectacle.
So it issues the prohibition and then kind of winks.
Precisely. It's two-faced. It says, don't do this, but then it encourages this cycle of sinning and repenting because the cycle itself is gratifying in a twisted way.
Okay, so what are the key features? If we're trying to spot this paraphilic superego in action, what should we look for?
Well, first, there's the obscene enjoyment of the law itself. The rules, the enforcement, they become exciting, emotionally charged, offering this surplus satisfaction beyond just keeping order.
Like a power trip almost.
Sort of, but deeper, libidinally charged. Then there's often a compulsion to transgress. The prohibition itself contains this lure, this tempting whisper, leading to these repetitive cycles. Sin, confess, punish, repeat.
Okay.
We also see strong elements of exhibitionism and voyeurism. Moral issues become a public stage. There's an urge to expose sinners, to put their flaws on display, and a corresponding urge for others to watch, often like it's entertainment.
Like public shaming becoming a spectacle.
Exactly that. And closely related is the fetishization of symbols or values. Certain ideals, maybe patriotism, purity, tradition, become these sacred objects, almost worshipped, but disconnected from actual lived reality or ethical behavior.
So you can cling to the symbol and feel righteous,
Even if your actions don't align.
Yeah.
Yeah. And finally, there's the capture of desire by the law. You might want the forbidden thing because it's forbidden. Or, conversely, you might obey the law strictly just to enjoy feeling morally superior to others.
You mentioned paraphilic has sexual roots, but this operates beyond just sex, right?
Oh, absolutely. The structure is perverse, like a paraphilia, but the content can be anything. Politics, religion, social issues, whatever. It operates with non-sexual content, but in a sexualized way, meaning it's emotionally charged, driven by these libidinal undercurrents.
Can you give an example of that? Non-sexual but sexualized.
Think about the term trauma porn. Sometimes it's used to describe the endless circulation of, say, videos of police brutality online.
Okay.
The argument is that while raising awareness is important, the constant passive viewing can become something else. Some critics have even compared viewers to crowds at a lynching, watching the spectacle of suffering. The moral discourse around it can become a way to circulate obscenity.
So the condemnation itself spreads the troubling imagery.
Exactly, like that infamous witch-hunting manual from 1487, the Malleus Maleficarum. Ostensibly, it was a guide to fighting evil, right?
Yeah.
But it spent pages and pages salaciously detailing all the lurid sexual acts witches supposedly engaged in. The sheer, almost pornographic relish in describing the sins completely betrayed this obsessive, fetishistic fascination.
So the law was getting off on describing the very thing it outlawed.
That's the core insight, yes. The paraphilic superego finds perverse enjoyment in the very images of transgression it declares forbidden. It gets off on its own enforcement and the violation it condemns.
That's a really powerful historical example. But it's important to be careful here, right? Not all strong moral conviction is automatically paraphilic. How do we draw the line?
That's crucial. No, genuine ethical commitment isn't this. The distinction lies in the mode of enjoyment and the compulsion. Look for that gratified frenzy, the theatrical excess, the hypocrisy often involved.
The performance aspect.
Yeah, and often that impossible, you must but you can't, double bind. Think about some forms of online activism where the standards are so pure, so impossible to meet, that everyone inevitably falls short and gets caught in cycles of guilt and calling each other out. It's when the moral stance becomes more about the jouissance of the performance than about actual ethical action.
Okay, that clarifies things. History seems absolutely full of examples where society's moral guardians acted out these perverse drives under the banner of righteousness. Public punishments, show trials. These feel like peak paraphilic superego moments.
They really do. These historical moments often mix the sacred and the profane in disturbing ways. You see didactic cruelty, public voyeurism, scapegoating, all used to manage anxiety but also provide these dark communal thrills.
Let's start with maybe the most famous example, the Salem witch trials in 1692. How does the paraphilic superego manifest there?
Salem was this perfect storm, right? A really strict Puritan community, high anxiety about sin and the devil. Then these young girls start having fits, accusing neighbors.
And it becomes a public spectacle.
Exactly. It became a stage. These girls, who normally had zero power, suddenly found themselves at the center of attention. And you can argue they found a kind of perverse enjoyment in that power, maybe even indulging in forbidding fantasies like descriptions of fine clothes given by the devil, but all under the cover of condemning witchcraft.
So is exhibitionism almost, speaking the unspeakable.
Yeah, speaking it to destroy it, but clearly relishing the act of speaking it too.
Yeah.
And the public got drawn in. Huge crowds packed the meeting house, watching the girls' dramatic fits, their synchronized accusations. It was described almost like mass hypnosis or maybe an early American horror show.
And the punishments themselves
Became spectacles of cruelty. The case of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old man pressed to death with stones because he refused to enter a plea. It's sheer barbarity presented as legal procedure. You get the sense the authorities found a grim, perverse satisfaction in breaking this stubborn old man.
horrifying.
It is. The core insight from Salem, I think, is how collective fear, when filtered through this kind of moralistic lens, can just explode into a public spectacle of sadistic enjoyment. And then afterward, there's often that collective guilt hangover when the frenzy finally breaks.
Right, the shame and remorse that followed. Okay, let's jump forward. The French Revolution's reign of terror, 1793-94, specifically Robespierre and the Festival of the Supreme Being. How does that fit?
Robespierre is fascinating here. He was the leader of the radical Jacobins, and he explicitly connected terror and virtue. He famously said, "Terror is nothing other than justice, an emanation of virtue."
He fetishized terror.
It seems like it. He presented mass execution almost as an act of moral jouissance, a necessary purging to achieve purity. And the Festival of the Supreme Being in 1794 was the peak of this performance.
What happened there?
It was this huge, highly choreographed event. Robespierre, dressed up, acted as a sort of high priest, burning effigies of atheism and vice, celebrating reason and virtue, all while the guillotines were working overtime just down the road.
Wow. The disconnect is staggering.
Completely. It was this fetishized image of purity designed to mask, to disavow the reality of the massacres, an excess of exhibitionism, as some historians call it. Ironically, this grand display kind of backfired, exposed his ego, and contributed to his own downfall soon after.
So the insight here is about extreme idealism mixed with extreme violence.
Yeah, how delirious idealism and delirious violence can go hand in hand, producing this perverse enjoyment of purity that ultimately consumes itself. It was the superego of the revolution in this grand, almost operatic display.
Chilling. Okay, moving into the 20th century. Stalin's show trial of Bukharin in 1938. What was going on there?
This was during Stalin's Great Purges. Nikolai Bukharin, once a top Bolshevik leader, was put on trial and forced through intense psychological pressure to confess to completely absurd crimes against the state. Crimes everyone knew he didn't commit.
So it was pure theater.
Pure, terrifying theater. It was a spectacle of the superego's total triumph. Bukharin performed this orgy of self-abasement, condemning himself while simultaneously professing loyalty to Stalin. He embodied the regime's brutal superego, finding this dark, perhaps necessary relief in submitting to punishment.
And the public. How did they react?
There was this dual enjoyment. On the surface, moral satisfaction. Oh, the traitors are being punished. But underneath, there was this lurid fascination with the conspiracy details, consuming it like some kind of macabre soap opera.
Even knowing it was likely false.
Exactly. Everyone kind of knew the confessions were coerced, fake, yet they participated in this grand ceremonial of terror. They accepted the lie as a necessary fiction, maybe deriving a cynical enjoyment from the shared, unspoken knowledge of the perversion. Izak calls this perversion at the level of the big other.
Meaning the whole system, the collective rules, are openly perverse.
Yeah, and demand you play along with the lie. The insight from Stalin's trials is how an authoritarian state can create this system where everyone is complicit in a known falsehood, generating a collective perversion. The enjoyment comes from both the public punishment and the shared cynicism.
Okay, one more historical case. The Cultural Revolution struggle sessions in China, starting around 1966.
Right. Mao Zedong basically unleashed the youth, the Red Guards, to attack the four olds. Old ideas, culture, customs, habits. This led to these incredibly brutal public humiliation rituals called struggle sessions.
Aimed at teachers, intellectuals, officials.
Exactly. People deemed counter-revolutionary. The case of Bian Zonyan is infamous, a vice principal at a girls' school in Beijing, beaten to death by her own teenage students. It just reveals this youthful superego unleashed in perverse fury.
Like a return of the repressed. All the built-up resentments exploded.
Yes, precisely. And the Maoist superego didn't just permit this violence against elders and authority figures, it actively glorified it as revolutionary action, purging the system.
And these sessions were theatrical.
Highly theatrical and deeply obscene. People were forced to wear humiliating placards, stand in painful positions like the airplane pose for hours, make forced confessions. There was often chanting, spitting, physical beatings, even sexual degradation, all framed as necessary purificatory cruelty.
But there was an enjoyment in it.
Reports suggest an almost ecstatic, frenzied enjoyment among the persecutors. The core insight here is how a mobilized youth, driven by a perverse ideology, can turn moral policing into this ritualized, sadistic carnival. It shows the terrifying potential for finding jouissance in collective, sanctioned violence.
Okay, so these historical examples are extreme, but they show the pattern. And you're saying this structure, this paraphilic superego, is still very much with us, just maybe morphed.
Absolutely. The form changes, but the underlying structure, it's alive and well, and digital technology has, in many ways, amplified it, creating global crowds where maybe once there were just village mobs.
How do we see it in media and entertainment today?
Well, think about reality TV. Shows like, say, The Old American Idol with its really harsh judge critiques, that was part of the entertainment, right? Watching people get torn down. Or shows like Cheaters or To Catch a Predator. They explicitly mix voyeurism, watching private transgressions, with public shaming and a sense of righteous judgment.
Yeah.
They provide this guilty pleasure by playing directly to that judgmental superego impulse in the audience.
So entertainment itself can be structured to give us a sanctioned outlet for this kind of enjoyment.
Exactly. It lets us indulge that voyeuristic, judgmental part of ourselves under the guise of entertainment or even public service.
And then there's social media. You mentioned cancel culture.
Yeah, online cancel culture is probably the most obvious contemporary example. It functions like a modern crowd's pillory.
How so?
Public figures, or even private ones sometimes, get denounced for perceived transgressions, often past ones. Their histories are dug up, they're attacked relentlessly, punished online, often losing jobs or reputations.
And the driving force feels righteous,
But there's often this palpable enjoyment in the destruction, isn't there? It can become almost addictive. Some people call it outrage porn. You get these little dopamine hits from participating in the moral aggression.
and virtue signaling fits in here too.
Yes, that's the flip side, the exhibitionist part. Conspicuously displaying your own moral purity, often by denouncing others. The Justine Sacco case back in 2013 is a classic example.
Remind us about that one.
She made a crass, arguably racist joke on Twitter before boarding a long flight. While she was in the air, it went globally viral. By the time she landed, she was the world's #1 villain, facing death threats, fired from her job. The sheer scale and, frankly, the glee involved in her takedown really exposed the spectator event nature of a lot of online shaming.
So the insight is that digital platforms enable these super rapid global moral panics.
Yeah, they function as modern public humiliations. And the nuance, the enjoyment, comes from that collective moral aggression, the feeling of righteousness, and the theatrical destruction of the perceived sinner.
Okay, shifting to politics and activism. You mentioned pseudo-radical moralism. What does that look like?
Well, you sometimes see it in certain progressive circles, this really intense policing of language, holding people to impossible standards of purity. It can lead to these purity spirals where activists turn on each other, constantly finding fault.
Like the woke eating their own trope.
That's the critique, yeah. Ishik points out the paradox in telling allies something like, you must constantly strive to understand oppression, but because of your privilege, you can never truly understand. It creates that you must, but you can't double bind.
Generating guilt.
Exactly. Guilt that can only be relieved, temporarily, by more public displays of self-criticism or allyship. Now, on the other side of the spectrum,
Conservative counterparts.
you see similar structures. Performative patriotism or religiosity, moral panic swept up over things like critical race theory or books in school libraries, calls for public shaming of teachers or librarians accused of being groomers.
Which sounds eerily like new witch hunts.
It has that same flavor, often fixated on supposed threats to children or sexual transgression. And then you have public apology rituals across the board.
Those often feel forced.
They often are, and they're rarely truly accepted, are they? The shaming continues because unconsciously the public enjoys the feeling of moral superiority. They don't actually want the cycle to end because the enjoyment would stop.
So the insight across these different political spheres is how ideological purity itself can become the vehicle for this paraphilic superego.
Yes. It generates these cycles of impossible demands, public shaming, and this perverse satisfaction derived from pursuing an elusive moral high ground, often at the expense of actual constructive action or empathy.
And quickly, in everyday life, ejects duty to be happy.
Yeah, that cultural pressure, especially amplified by social media, to perform happiness, to live your best life, and broadcast it. It creates this background hum of guilt and anxiety if you're not feeling that way, if your life doesn't look like the curated feeds.
It turns enjoyment into an obligation.
Precisely. And then you have things like ubiquitous surveillance cameras combined with phenomena like Karen videos online. Voyeurism becomes normalized, and pointing out someone else's bad behavior, even if initially justified, can easily slide into becoming just another form of shaming entertainment.
Okay, so this deep dive has really laid out the pervasive nature of this paraphilic superego. Pulling it all together, what are the absolute key takeaways about desire, authority, and us?
I think the first is how much this shapes our collective fantasies. The superego's obscene underside projects society's forbidden desires and anxieties onto scapegoats, witches, traitors, predators, whoever. Their punishment then becomes this grand public drama.
And the jouissance aspect is key to understanding why it persists.
Absolutely central. People don't just obey or enforce the law neutrally. They find ways to get something extra out of it, maybe sadistic pleasure in punishing, or a masochistic satisfaction in suffering for a righteous cause, or just the thrill of transgression. That surplus enjoyment is why logical arguments often bounce right off these dynamics.
It also powerfully highlights the two faces of authority, right? The official story versus the secret supplement.
Exactly. That split law. There's the public ideal, and then there are the unwritten, often obscene rules about what's really permitted or even demanded. This creates confusion, doublethink, and it erodes genuine moral judgment. People end up just following the loudest or most intimidating superego voice, abdicating their own ethical agency.
And the consequences are pretty severe, both personally and socially.
Hugely. For individuals, it can mean trauma, crushing guilt, a fragmented sense of self. For communities, it can lead to cycles of manic fury followed by depressive regret, a breakdown of trust, profound injustice, even collective PTSD after periods of intense moral panic.
So why? Why does the superego turn perverse like this? What makes it go rogue?
Well, psychoanalytically, it's often seen as arising from internalized aggression that hasn't found a healthy outlet. When external societal checks and balances weaken, think of unstable times, revolutions, or online spaces. With few rules, this internalized aggression can explode outward, but disguised as moral righteousness.
And maybe black desire plays a role.
Yeah, if people feel their legitimate desires for satisfaction or recognition are blocked, moral outrage can become a substitute. They find a detour enjoyment in being the punisher, the accuser, or even the virtuous martyr.
Given how insidious this is, how can we even begin to resist it? In ourselves and in society?
It's tough. But one path is consciously cultivating an ethics beyond the superego. That means focusing on genuine subjective responsibility, thinking for yourself, critical thinking, empathy, and having the individual moral courage to resist groupthink, even when it feels righteous.
Like those few who stood against the tide in Salem.
Exactly. Another angle is finding harmless ways to ritualize transgression. Think of art, satire, comedy, even some forms of protest. They can act as a pressure valve, letting out some of that energy without causing real harm. Humor and humility in power structures are really important counterweights.
And the rule of law.
Absolutely crucial. Due process, checks and balances, rules of evidence, these are Enlightenment achievements specifically designed to cool down those collective passions, to prevent society from regressing into superego-driven mob rule. When we bypass them in the name of expediency or outrage, we're playing with fire.
And finally, maybe just fostering empathy.
Yeah, building genuine mutual recognition and care. Trying to see people, both the accused and the accusers, the authorities and the dissenters, as complex human beings, not just pure good or pure evil symbols. That complexity helps dilute the fanaticism that the superego thrives on.
This has been incredibly illuminating. It really highlights that tension at the core of being human. The struggle between taking genuine ethical responsibility for our actions and desires and the seductive, pernicious enjoyment offered by the superego.
It does, and maybe a final thought for you, the listener. As you observe the world and your own reactions, consider your investment in morality. Are you truly pursuing justice? Or is there also a part of you that's, well, getting off on the hunt, on the feeling of purity or righteous anger?
Are you defending the law, or maybe using the law as an excuse to play God, to enjoy judging others?
It's a challenging question, but reckoning with those secret pleasures, the pleasures of punishing, the pleasures of purity, seems essential if we want to build a more humane world.
Yeah.
It's about trying to integrate our own shadows rather than constantly trying to exercise them onto other people.
Which is arguably the hardest revolution of all, the one within ourselves.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope this exploration gives you a new, perhaps unsettling but valuable lens through which to view the world, and maybe even your own mind.